is this hair? And why is my head so just like... Hey, Miss Kitty. Ooh. Oh, there's a drawer. Ooh, there's a drawer full of socks. Doing? What are you doing, Miss Fuzzy Butt? Are you looking for something? Can I help you find something? Wait, what's my... push to talk is. Oh, okay. Okay, that doesn't work. That's unfortunate.
All right. Well, I am ready to go if Sage is. I think Sage should probably go first because the nature of the resolution is um, in that physician-assisted suicide ought not be legal, I believe.
I'm ready.
Okay, cool. Van, are you going to be the moderator?
Uh, Hang on one sec.
Okay.
I mean, unless you, I mean, you guys kind of heard how I was moderating um, yesterday. Is I kind of just I didn't really do a whole lot, so I think for the most part, um, I'm just gonna kind of let you guys do your thing. Obviously, if you guys need any direction or if there's too much silence, I'll throw my ugly voice in. But for the most part, I think I just want to let you guys kind of take it at your own pace.
Yeah, I'm cool with that. So Sage can go first, and I will let her have it.
Okay. Physician assisted suicide has been a more discussed topic lately and has become legalized in some places and is on its way to being legalized in some places. I will argue this is not something we should be looking at as an option or solution to anything, and it should remain illegal. Physician assisted death refers to the intentional and deliberate ending of the life of a patient on part of the physician. This intentional aiming of death clearly distinguishes physician assisted death from other practices in end life medical care, such as palliative care, terminal sedation, or withholding or withdrawing life sustaining therapies. It overturns a fundamental principle of law in medicine, contradicting key medical ethics recognized in the Hippocratic Oath and nationally recognized by the World Medical Association. In the journal, Kavanaugh writes the Hippocratic Oath rightly prohibits doctors from giving deadly drugs even if anonymous patients ask for them. By assisting in the suicide of a terminally ill patient who wants to determine the
Yeah,
manner
move
of
it,
his
Skinny.
death, the physician inappropriately medicalizes morality itself. He also jeopardizes the welfare of other vulnerable patients. The World Medical Association says the WMA reiterates its strong commitment to principles of medical ethics and that utmost respect has to be maintained for human life. Therefore, the WMA is firmly opposed to euthanasia and physician assisted suicide. For the purpose of this declaration, the euthanasia is defined as a physician deliberately administering a lethal substance or carrying out an intervention to cause the death of a patient with decision making capacity at the patient's own voluntary request. Physician assisted suicide refers to cases which, at the voluntary request of a patient with the decision making capacity, and a physician deliberately enables a patient to end his or her own life by prescribing or providing medical substances with intent to bring about death. Doctors exist to protect life and health to help improve the patient's quality of life, not to put an end to it. Another reason to keep physician assisted suicide illegal is the reason why people seek it. In the book 10 Arguments Against Physician Assisted Suicide by Iwan Goler, he says patients seek physician assisted death not primarily because of physical suffering or uncontrolled pain, but rather because life with suffering seems pointless to them in light of the loss of autonomy, independence, or sense of meaning and purpose. Survey data presented in this book demonstrate that uncontrolled physical pain and symptoms are far from the main reasons that patients seek physician-assisted death. Rather, patients seek death because of the concerns over loss of autonomy and independence, a fear of being a burden, and a sense of meaningless and purposelessness in life. No less than other forms of suicide, a desire for physician-assisted death is an expression of despair. Because these forms of suffering represent existential, physiological, and spiritual phenomena, they are far more difficult for doctors to address. Indeed, they are more properly addressed through pastoral care. Physician assisted death represents a desperate attempts by doctors to overcome the spiritual challenges presented by suffering and death. People seek suicide because they feel pressured and like they are burdening those around them. The Anscombe Bioethics Center says the bioethicist Nicholas Tony once warned that fear of being a burden is a major risk to the survival of those who are chronically ill. When the law changes, the evidence is that such feelings become more common. In Oregon, those dying in part because of fear of being a burden on family/friends and caregivers increased from 13% in 1998 to 54.2% in 2021. In Washington, it rose from 23% in 2009 to 59% in 2022. The law implicitly promotes this attitude. Certainly, many people now seek assisted death for this reason. Rarely is this reasoning overtly defended, but in March 2024, the former conservative MP Matthew Parris argued that assisted suicide was needed because society simply cannot afford the burden of caring for older people. Your time is up will never be in order, but yes, the objectors are right, may one day be the kind of unspoken hint that everybody understands. This debate comes down to 3 questions my opponent must answer. First, they must prove intentionally ending a patient's life is compatible with medical ethics, even though every major medical body rejects it. Second, they must prove that legalizing assisted dying won't pressure vulnerable people or expand beyond its limits despite overwhelming evidence that it always does. Third, they must prove that death is the best or necessary response to suffering, even though effective, compassionate alternatives already exist. If they cannot prove all 3, then physician-assisted suicide should not be legalized. Physician-assisted suicide should be illegal because it violates medical ethics in place. The reasoning patients seek it. Alternatives are available. That doesn't include death, and it devalues people. I urge you to stand up for those who are vulnerable and be on the side of life for all.
All right, cool. Thank you guys. Thank you very much, Miss Sage. So a few things. I recently got COVID, so my voice might sound terrible. So I apologize for anyone who can't understand what I'm saying. Second off, I'm going to be sharing my screen, and it's going to be for the Google Slide presentation you can see in chat that's called PAS. I'm going to try, and it probably isn't going to work, presentation on my end and walk through that way screen. If I start cutting out, let me know, because Discord has hated me in the past doing this. If I start cutting out, let me know. But I think we should be good.
You already are cutting.
Can you hear me? Band, can you hear? Already cut. It's amazing. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, you're just getting choppy, like really choppy.
All right, you know what? Forget about it. So, you guys click on the Google Slide presentation, and then like if you want to go in with me with it, that way, I don't know what Discord hates it whenever I do this, so I don't know why. But anyway, today we're talking about the physician-assisted suicide, also known as euthanasia, also known as euthanasia, also known as assisted suicide in general. I will be defending this position. I think that it is a morally good one, and I think in general this is something that ought to be legal. So what is physician-assisted suicide? So there are many synonymous terms like euthanasia, assisted suicide. However, for this debate, I will be defining physician-assisted suicide as when a physician aids or causes suicide in a terminally ill patient, because that's the definition that Washington versus Glucksberg in 1997 found as being a positive definition. So to avoid confusion in this debate, I'm going to be using all terms related to physician-assisted suicide basically interchangeably, so that way we don't have to spend too much time defining each and every single term or being like, well, that's not technically this is technically not that. That way we can just have like a debate over the morality, the pertinent issues involved. So on slide 3, you see this 4-pronged chart. And on the north and the x-axis, we have voluntary and involuntary. And on the y-axis, we have passive and active. And this breakdown is from Rachel's in 1975. Basically, there are 4 different types of physician-assisted suicide. The first one is passive voluntary in quadrant 1. The second one is active voluntary in quadrant 2. And then passive involuntary in quadrant 3. And then active involuntary in quadrant 4. And I'm going to be explaining each of these. So, passive voluntary is perhaps the least objectionable form of physician-assisted suicide. I actually don't think Sage disagrees with this one. I can ask, we can find out later in the debate, but if I had to guess, I would imagine Sage actually probably agrees with passive voluntary assisted suicide. This is like when a physician simply allows a patient to die when they've consented. So this is considered like a DNR, do not resuscitate, or a pulling of the plug. This method is somewhat legal in the US. So, for example, if you have a patient who is not going to survive their terminally ill status and they simply allow the patient to die instead of trying to continually keep them alive, that's passive voluntary. And that's the form that's like least objectionable. Most people will agree with this in some way. So then there comes active voluntary. This is the one that we will be debating tonight. This is the one that I would agree with, and my opponent would not. So this is when a physician does something to end the life of a patient with that patient's consent. So, for example, giving too much painkillers, death with dignity statues, etc. It's a legally dubious area. It's kind of a gray area in the law, but I would argue ultimately it should be legal. So then we get to passive involuntary. This is one that's illegal. And I'm pretty sure Sage and I both disagree with this one. So passive involuntary is whenever a doctor allows a patient's death without their consent. This is 100% negligence and almost quite possibly murder. It's almost always illegal, and it almost certainly should be. And then we get to active involuntary. Active involuntary is when a physician does something to kill a patient without their consent. And this is 100% murder. Everyone treats this as murder. It is unquestionably illegal, and it should be illegal. So here's my stance explained one last time. If you're following along, it should be on slide 8. It ought to be legal for a physician to either refrain from actions or commit action to a terminal patient with their consent, of course. So affirming passive voluntary and active voluntary. The framework for the debate is going to be soft consequential utilitarianism. That the action which best raises the well-being, the health, happiness, longevity, or quality of a person's life, or best removes impediments or harm, is the morally good action. So for slide 9, here's my first argument for this. There is no consequential difference between letting die and killing. For those of you who are familiar with the trolley car meme, this is actually a philosophical thought experiment from Philippia Foot in 1967. And the idea behind the trolley car problem is that imagine you are standing in front of a trolley car that has gone completely off the rails and it's going to hit someone, right? It's either going to hit these people on the left, which are 5 people who've done nothing wrong, or it's going to hit the person on the right. Right now, it's hitting everyone straight. It's going to hit all the people on those 5 people, right? So you, as the individual in the middle, can either allow this trolley car to hit 5 people, or you can divert the tracks and hit 1. If you choose to do nothing, if you let people die, you've let 5 people suffer. However, if you do something, you've killed 1 person. But consequentially, what's the difference? Well, the difference is by pulling the rod, by pulling the track alternator, you've killed 1 instead of killing 5. So consequentially, there is no real difference between just letting people die and killing. And that is an important thing to us to remember, right? If you, as a doctor, end the life of a patient who is already dying, is that consequentially different from letting them die from natural causes anyway an hour or 2 later? And I think that I would posit, no, it's not. But that brings me to my second contention. An active voluntary euthanasia is more humane. If a patient is in the process of dying, ending that suffering is more ethical. That way, we are not simply prolonging the suffering unnecessarily. And this is from Rachel's in 75 again. And he writes this passage, it's a bit long, but I think it's really good. A patient who is dying is in terrible pain, which can no longer be satisfactorily alleviated. He is certain to die within a few days, even if present treatment is continued. But he does not want to go on living for those days since the pain is unbearable. Suppose the doctor agrees to withhold treatment, as conventional doctrine says he may. The justification for doing so is that the patient is in terrible agony, and since he is going to die anyway, he would be wrong to prolong his suffering needlessly. But now notice this. If one imply withholds treatment, then it may take the patient longer to die, and so he may suffer more than he would if direct action were taken and lethal injection given. This fact provides strong reason for thinking that once the initial decision to not prolong his agony has been made, active euthanasia is actually preferable to passive euthanasia rather than the reverse. So to say otherwise is to endorse the option that leads to more suffering rather than less. And it is contrary to the humanitarian impulse that prompts a decision not to prolong his life to begin with. So to summarize what Rachel's is writing here, imagine if you're a doctor and your patient is going to die, and everyone in the building has already agreed that you can just let them pass on to the next life. You can just let them pass on into death. You don't need to keep saving them, because if you do, you're going to be prolonging their suffering. Well, you know they're going to die in a few hours. You know they're going to suffer. That process to that is going to be very painful. So why not just inject something anyway to end it immediately? And that's what Rachel's is arguing for. In fact, in some cases, active voluntary euthanasia is more humane because it ends the suffering that is required for someone to naturally die. And contention number 3. I imagine this will be the one that Sage and I, despite argues over for the most. So contention number 3 is respect for autonomy. It is imperative for a physician to respect the autonomous decisions of the patient so long as those decisions do not result in physical harm to another. So in her speech, when she was talking about how physician suicide harms others, physically it does not. And it is not the doctor's job to make sure that the patient they are treating, that their treatment aligns with whatever would mentally be best for other people. It is whether or not it doesn't physically harm others. Ergo, denying the request puts them into harm and also ignores their autonomy. And that is a violation of their rights, according to Brock in 1993. And this is something I will expand upon later as well. So there are a few technical differences, but that more or less sums up my position on the debate. So because there is no difference between letting die and killing, and because physician-assisted suicide does limit the pain of death that it is caused naturally, and because it respects the autonomous rights of the patient, I see no other reason than to affirm physician-assisted suicide as ethical. Now, my opponent mentioned a lot of things that I would actually love to go over if given the chance, but I want to make sure this stands even and unbiased, so I would be okay with, even and fair. So if she wants to move into a cross-ex or she wants to do replies, either one is fine with me. So thank you, everyone, for listening.
Okay. I'd like to go ahead and make my case, and then you can make your case, and then we can do rebuttals after.
Great to me.
Okay, so all human beings have intrinsic value by virtue of what we are. Characteristics of intrinsic values are priceless and irreplaceable. Like the Mona Lisa painting, for example, has intrinsic value because of its historical, cultural, and artistic significance. And you can't really put a price on that. Humans are both priceless and irreplaceable. Each person is unique and has intrinsic value that they hold. Here's how Ewan connects that to physician-assisted suicide. He says, to understand the connection between intrinsic value and the wrongness of causing death, consider the following syllogism. If something has intrinsic value, it is always good that it exists. If it is good for something to exist, it's not appropriate to end its existence. Therefore, if people have intrinsic value, it is not appropriate to intentionally end their existence. There is a deep connection between value and the goodness of existence. To say that something has value is to say it is good that it exists. This is easily appreciated by reversing the logic. If you say that it does not matter whether something exists, you are also saying that it is of no particular value. So we cannot value something without also valuing its existence. Now, if something is intrinsically valuable, then its value is unconditional. And if its value is unconditional, then the value of its existence is unconditional. And if something has intrinsic value, then it's unconditionally good that it exists. So to suggest that it is better for something not to exist is necessarily to declare that it does not have intrinsic value. Claiming that it is good to end someone's existence implies that their existence is not unconditionally good, rather, the goodness of their existence is conditional. If this were the case, they would not possibly have intrinsic value. But since we have established that people have intrinsic value, we are forced to conclude that their existence is unconditionally good. If this is the case, then it is never good for them to cease existing, and it is not appropriate to intentionally cause their death. Those who are caring for the sick and suffering should be helping them through it and reminding them of their intrinsic worth, not reinforcing their feelings of worthlessness and uselessness. The presumption of knowing what it is like to be dead is also made when using death as a remedy for suffering. Ewan in his book says physician-assisted death purports to be an act of compassion or mercy. To claim that death is good for you, you have to make the assumption about what it is like to be dead. Uncertainty over what it's like to be dead famously prevented Hamlet from taking his own life in Shakespeare's play. Claiming to help someone by taking their life is boldly presumptuous. If and when only if we know what it is like to be dead, can we confidently assert that someone is better off dead. The question is whether doctors have grounds for such knowledge of what it is like to be dead. In fact, this is a philosophical question inaccessible to the empirical methods of medical science. Doctors cannot pronounce any authority on whether there is life after death. Neither indeed can patients. Claims about the existence and nature of life after death will always be matters of speculation apart from divine revelation, and this is just as true for those who deny the possibility of life after death as it is for those who believe in the possibility of life after death. Those who argue in the assisted death do not typically cite scripture or divine revelation in support of the. Most advocates for the practice cite their anesthetic commitments as motivation for their support for physician-assisted death. Physician-assisted death should therefore be understood as an act of deep faith in one's personal philosophical convictions about the nature of ultimate reality and human existence. In this sense, it is very much a religious, if godless practice rather than a scientific evidence-based practice. Another problem with physician-assisted suicide is it normalizes suicide for some. The Anscombe Bioethics Center says when we think of conventional unassisted suicide, we often think of a physically healthy but mentally distressed young person. This is very different from a typical assisted suicide, an older person with incurable illness. But assisted and unassisted suicide are not always so different. People who attempt suicide may be older or have an incurable illness. In Canada, people in this category who have attempted suicide have been offered made as an alternative. Legalizing assisted suicide undermines the imperative of suicide prevention, the fundamental belief that every suicide is a tragedy. A change in the law is associated with significant increases in conventional suicide in the population, 6% overall and 13% among women, and a still greater increase in self-initiated deaths, assisted plus unassisted suicides. We need to think how to better to prevent suicide among people with serious physical diseases, but the evidence is that legalizing assisted suicide makes things worse. Suicide of all kinds should not be an option and should be prevented. Normalizing it makes suicide go up. We should do everything in our power to decrease suicide of all kinds. Not only is the normalization of suicide a problem, but it being legalized also expands the practice past what is intended. The Anscombe Bioethics Center says assisted dying tends to expand in numbers. Canada, which legalized MAID in 2016, recorded 13,241 assisted deaths in 2022. It also expands in eligibility criteria. In Belgium, originally, it applied only to adults. This restriction was abandoned in 2014. In the Netherlands, doctors were at first required to inform patients of the timing of the euthanasia. In 2019, a court case approved the euthanasia of someone with dementia who could not be informed or consent and who had to be restrained for the lethal injection. In Canada, at first, death had to be reasonably foreseeable. This was abandoned in 2021. In Colombia, at first, the patient had to be in the terminal phase. This was also abandoned in 2021. In Oregon, assisted suicide is only for terminal illness, but in 2021, this was deemed to include anorexia. Also in Oregon, the residency requirement was abandoned in 2022. Law and practice expand because of the logic of assisted dying. If intentionally ending the life on request is the ultimate means to end human suffering, then it should expand to reach all those whose suffering could be ended. This increases death and it normalizes it more. And then suicide is even higher. Now let's discuss the alternatives to physician-assisted suicide. Brian Anderson discusses these in an article he wrote, and he says, for those in physical pain, palliative care and other pain management can manage their symptoms effectively. For those whom death is imminent, hospice care and fellowship to accompany them in their last days is what true death with dignity looks like. Palliative care focuses on improving a patient's quality of life by alleviating pain and other distressing symptoms of a serious illness. Palliative care is an option for people of any age at any stage in illness, whether that illness is curable, chronic, or life-threatening. So there are other options and alternatives such as pain management options, palliative care, and hospice, which are much better options than ending their life. Physician-assisted suicide being legal takes from funding and provision of palliative care. The Anscombe Bioethics Center says in 2014, a House of Commons committee did not see evidence of palliative care deteriorating after a change in the law, but at least in some places, an improvement in palliative care. This conclusion relied, however, on partial and prospective evidence. Belgium increased palliative care provision from 2002 to 2011, but since 2012, it has fallen behind non-euthanasia countries. In 2017, Canada promised $6 billion to palliative care over 10 years, but after 5 years, it had only spent a fraction of this. In 2022, New South Wales promised $743 million over 5 years, but in 2023, the annual palliative care budget was cut by $249 million. Promises are not evidence. Palliative care aims to improve pain relief, but in Oregon, those seeking assisted death because of pain has increased from 7% in 1998 to 34.3% in 2023. And in Washington from 25% in 2009 to 46% in 2022. And in Canada from 53.9% in 2019 to 59.2% in 2022. Paradoxically, an increase in assisted deaths is linked to an increase in pain or fear of pain. Expecting palliative care services to deliver assisted dying has also caused moral distress and has led people to consider leaving the profession. In Canada, it has caused legal disputes and the closure of at least one hospice. Legalizing euthanasia or assisted suicide is strongly opposed by the Association of Palliative Medicine. Physician-assisted suicide is not what is best for anyone and should not be legal because it has deadly consequences.
Okay, cool. I'm going to jump right in. So, my opponent laid out three things that I think are pertinent in this discussion. She stated that unless I could defend these three propositions, then her case wins. And I actually think I can take on all three propositions. The first one that she named was that ending a patient is in line, or sorry, ending patient's life is not in line with medical ethics. The second one is that we are pressuring people by having physician assisted suicide. And the third one is that I need to prove that death is the best response. So, first off, on the medical ethics side, my opponent talks a lot about the Hippocratic Oath. However, the Hippocratic Oath is not, or excuse me, medical ethics and physicians do not adhere to something as simple as do no harm. I know that's a hard thing to swallow, but a Hippocratic Oath is not the all encompassing rule for medical ethics. There's actually way more. So, I have two responses to this. First response, medical ethics that physicians adhere to is not as simple as do no harm. Medical ethics is far more broad. Medical ethics is actually composed of what are called the four principles, which are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Autonomy refers to the patient's right to make their own decisions and the duty of the physician to respect those decisions, to the extent that it is not to otherwise break the law or physically harm others. Beneficence is about acting in the best interests of the patient. Non-maleficence is closest to the Hippocratic Oath. It involves liability, ensures the patient does not take steps that would harm the patient. Justice refers to distribution of resources following the law and respect of the patient's rights. This is according to Dickenstein in 1991. In addition to this, Hartman in 98 offers the following. The Hippocratic Oath, which is often used as though it was a clear, single, and simple guideline, is not a clear, simple guideline. A serious discussion of its problems and clashes with practice, with other ethical guidelines, and with regulations, economic pressures, and laws would be timely and useful. Far so more than the current admitted by those who have not read the Hippocratic Oath, or those who only vaguely remember it, or those who want to be above the dispute. In other words, this debate is over what principles to ensure first is wide without no, excuse me, this debate is over what principles to ensure first is wide and no uniform agreement or consensus exists. Second response, active voluntary euthanasia does less harm. This is something my opponent didn't discuss. According to Rachel's in 75, whenever a patient is allowed to, whenever a physician allows for a patient who will die to simply continue the pain of dying, they are allowing more harm they would be causing by killing the patient themselves. Also recall the trolley car problem. There is no consequential difference in allowing death or causing it, especially from the stance of a physician and their patient. Simply put, a doctor causes more harm by allowing a patient to suffer, and they ignore the autonomous rights of the patient as well. So that's the first argument dealt with. Ending a patient's life in assisted suicide is not actually against the medical ethical code that physicians adhere to. So the first part is dealt with. The second part for pressuring people. So this is a bit of an oversimplification. Whenever people discuss or whenever doctors go through the process of adhering to assisted suicide, there's a lot of steps that are actually that go into this that don't amount to just pressuring people. So one step, for example, of this, hang on, I'm trying to find the exact source, but there is a lot of safeguards. So here, this is for third response. Because there are always some risks, the medical establishment already takes major precautions to ensure the patient will not die anyway. According to Pope in 2017, there are major required safeguards which minimize such risks like pressuring people, which are the patient passes a mental health evaluation, the patient is terminally ill, the patient can self-administer, capacity, that there is no advance directives, that there is a waiting period, that it only applies to non-pregnant adult, and that there are 2 doctors which sign off. So the idea of pressuring people is not the real concern here. And for third, death is the best response. Well, it is. If you're going to allow someone to keep dying, right, to keep suffering and then die, how is ending that suffering before it's needed to, right? Not the more moral option. Remember, the alternative is that somebody will continue suffering throughout their time. And I don't see how that's a more morally good thing to do. So yeah, I don't know if we want to get into open dialogue now. That would be cool for me, but that'd be great.
I have rebuttals prepared. First rebuttal addressed is it's argued that some dying people will still experience unbearable suffering even with the palliative care. And is unbearable suffering is a tragedy, but doesn't justify intentionally ending a human life. And palliative care today
Can I
continues.
ask really quickly? Are we doing like a line by line like rebuttals, or did you want to like do a discussion on these?
I have line by line like rebuttals, and then I was gonna thinking we could do that open discussion after with like
Okay, well, I'll let
questions.
you go. I'll let you go. Yeah, cool. I'll let you go, and then we can do line by line.
Okay. So, unbearable suffering is a tragedy, but doesn't justify intentionally ending a human life. Palliative care today continues to advance, and rare cases of refractory symptoms call for better care, not the introduction of killing as a medical solution. The purpose of medicine is to relieve suffering without eliminating the patient. Once intentional death as a treatment is accepted, then the role of the physician is redefined and the trust that vulnerable patients place in their caregivers is undermined. Another argument is that assisted dying is legal for 150 million people with safeguards. But legality does not equal morality or safety. In many jurisdictions that legalized assisted dying have documented safeguard erosion expanding from terminal illness to disability, mental illness, and even loneliness. And the existence of safeguards on paper does not guarantee protection in practice. The UK should not adopt a policy simply because others have. It should evaluate the real world consequences, including documented cases of abuse, corrosion, and wrongful deaths. Some say we already have safeguards for withdrawing treatment, so we should also use them for assisted dying. Well, withdrawing treatment and intentionally causing death are ethically distinct. Withdrawing treatment allows the underlying disease to take its natural course, and assisted dying intentionally ends a life. The safeguards for one cannot simply be transferred to the other because the moral action is fundamentally different. Once the law authorizes doctors to intentionally cause death, the burden of proof shifts and vulnerable people face new pressures, subtle, systematic, and impossible to fully regulate. Some argue the current law forces people to travel abroad and creates inequality, and the solution to inequality is not to normalize physician-assisted death, but to improve domestic end-of-life care and support. And the fact that some people travel abroad does not justify changing the moral foundation of UK medicine. We do not legalize harmful practices simply because some people seek them elsewhere. Moreover, the lack of oversight abroad is an argument for caution, not for expanding access at home. It is also argued there is widespread public support, so it should be legalized. Public opinion cannot be the sole basis for ethical medical policy, and history shows that popular opinion has often supported practices later recognized as harmful or discriminatory. The role of law is to protect the vulnerable, not to follow shifting public sentiment. When life and death decisions are at stake, the standard must be human dignity, not polling data. Another argument is autonomy means people should choose when they die and doctors shouldn't impose beliefs. Autonomy is important, but it is not absolute. No society allows individuals to demand that a doctor intentionally end their life. Medicine has always drawn a line between healing and killing. Allowing assisted dying transforms autonomy into a claim over another person's actions, requiring a doctor to participate in ending a life. Protecting physicians from being compelled is not enough. We must also protect patients from internalized pressure, subtle corrosion, and the belief that their lives are burdensome. Lastly, it's argued that assisted dying brings peace of mind even if a few use it. Peace of mind cannot justify legalizing the intentional ending of a human life. In countries where assisted dying is legal, the option quickly becomes the social expectation. especially for the elderly, disabled, or those who feel like a burden. The reassurance of a few cannot outweigh the risk to many, especially those who are vulnerable, isolated, or depressed. True peace of mind comes from compassionate care, not from the availability of death. That's my rebuttal section.
Okay, cool. So let's since we're doing line by line, let's get into the first part. So would you say that medical ethics is only the Hippocratic Oath, or do you think there's more to consider?
I think there's more to consider. Yeah.
Sure. So, like, how can you balance, say, a patient's autonomy if you deny, as a physician, if you deny their wishes?
Because I would say because you're crossing the line by intentionally killing them. I think like suicide like is when if someone like if they regular suicide, you wouldn't let someone make that choice. You would do everything you can to prevent it. I think the same should happen in this case.
For
They
sure.
need mental help and they need comfort, and then they need like as much care as possible to minimize the pain, but I don't think intentionally killing them is the solution.
Whenever you compare, like, someone who has depression and therefore wants suicide, 90+% of all depression cases are solvable, right? Even medical depression is solvable. In this case, with physician-assisted suicide, we aren't talking about someone who has depression. We're talking about someone who is going to die anyway, and they're suffering from it. So I don't see why we should ignore their autonomy just because you think they might be sad about dying.
Well, because it's found that most want to seek it out of feeling depressed or the fear of being a burden, not actually due to the suffering. And especially when we have
Well,
alternatives that don't include killing them, I think it
well,
shouldn't be allowed.
all alternatives would prolong their suffering, though, right? Like, every alternative would require them staying in their bed, losing their autonomy, and then dying very slowly and painfully. So how is that not, like, causing more pain to just let someone die naturally than to just let them die without pain?
Because we can minimize that pain with medicine, and there's also sedative palliative care, and it reduces the pain a lot. And there's also
Well,
like
actually,
a lot of different pain management out there that they can use.
okay. So your primary claim is that it is not okay to end someone's life, even though they're suffering, even though they're going to die, because there are alternatives to ending their pain. So if there are not alternatives, would it then be okay to do it?
Um, yeah, if there wasn't a better alternative to it, then yeah, I would say it would
Okay, cool,
be
because I
okay.
can nip this in the bud right now. For all people who are following along and can see on the chat, I have 3 responses to the claim that there are alternative kinds of care. So the claim is that there are medications which can differ, or excuse me, medications and different medical care which can alleviate the pain, and I have 3 responses to this. First response, unfortunately, this is not the case. According to Young in 2024, while both good palliative care and good hospice care make important contributions to the care of the dying, neither is a panacea. To get the best palliative care for an individual involves trial and error, with some consequent suffering in the process. Moreover, even the best care fails to relieve all pain and suffering. Perhaps even more importantly, high quality palliative care commonly exacts a price in the form of side effects such as nausea, incontinence, loss of awareness because of semi-permanent drowsiness, and so on. A rosy picture is often painted for how palliative care can be transformed the plight of the dying. Such a picture is misleading according to those who have closely observed the effect of extended courses of treatment with drugs like morphine. For these reasons, many skilled palliative care specialists acknowledge that palliative care does not enable an easy death for the patient. Simply put, there is no magical medication or process which will substantially remove all pain, and attempting to resolve pain otherwise can actually make a person suffer more. For the second response, this sort of care is just widely not available. Whether because of finances or just lack of resources, the level of care that could even hypothetically resolve the pain of dying is not nearly as available as it would need for Sage's argument to work. What's even more ironic is that many of those in hospice care or otherwise still request physician assisted suicide. And for my third response, not all pain is physical. A physician is not only responsible for the physical pain of a patient, but physicians also have a duty to consider the mental well being of their patients as well. According to Ferdinand et al. And Rodnan in 2007, only 22% of patients in hospice cited physical pain as the reason for their wanting pass. 90% of patients highlighted a lack of autonomy, 70% to highlight a lack of dignity, and 52% said they did not want to be dependent. In fact, Rouse et al. In 2011 found that 22% who did cite physical pain did not cite it as the primary reason. In fact, to really put the nail in the coffin, quality of palliative care does not appear to impact the patient's wishes at all. According to The Economist in 2010 and the report Quality of Death, nations with better palliative care still see higher requests for physician-assisted suicide. So to summarize for everyone, not all pain is physical. Very few of the terminally ill ask for suicide because of physical pain, and it's more about dignity and autonomy. Even under the best conditions with the best palliative care, patients still ask for physician-assisted suicide. So I guess I would have three questions for you, Sage. First off, if palliative care, the quality of it, can actually change a person's asking for physician-assisted suicide, then why is it with better quality care people ask for more physician-assisted suicide?
Because, well, as you said, it's not mostly it's not because of physical pain. It's mostly mental, which is why I think the mental health is what needs to happen, and you need to help them. They're having feelings of worthlessness or being a burden to everyone.
It's lack of autonomy. It's that the patient can't actually control their bodies anymore. Their patient can't stand up on their own. They can't eat on their own. They can't do those things. There's no medicine that will cure that, right? So they're still going to have that lack of autonomy even in the best palliative care.
Yeah, that's why I think they should be made as comfortable as possible. They should be fully supported, and in like rare cases where the symptoms can't be controlled, they do use the palliative sedation.
Right. So, but even in the best situations, right, in nations which have the absolute best palliative care, there actually is an increase in the number of people who request physician-assisted suicide. So it's not a question of quality of medical care, because even in places where they have the best medical care, they still want physician-assisted suicide.
I think it's because the root of the problem isn't addressed. They need mental help, they need support, and just like the fact that physician assisted suicide is an option, they can feel pressured to do that.
Okay, but there's no medicine you can give someone which will restore their autonomy, right? There's no medicine or surgery you can give someone that will restore their autonomy when they're dying. They're already going to die in a few hours.
Death isn't the answer to suffering. They're not intentionally killing them.
There's no alternative, though. Either they continue suffering, they continue having no autonomy, and then they have a worse hour, 2 hours left of life, or they can take their own lives and have no pain. So why would it be better to continue their suffering and continue denying their autonomy?
Because we need better care, better help, and because it will just keep updating with all the new technology and stuff. It will only get better from there. It will updates and advancements, all that, and it's better than intentionally killing someone. That shouldn't be a solution. That's not care. That's just ending it.
But what you're missing is that in the best countries with the best palliative care, requests for physician-assisted suicide increase. It's not about quality of care, which causes people to not want physician-assisted suicide. It's about things that dying does to a person, which medical care can't change. No amount of medical care can change a dying person's autonomous status, their pain. There's no medicine that relieves all pain. That's still going to exist. There is no alternative. I mean, yeah, I would agree with you if there was a magical pill that could give dying people 100% autonomy or prevent their death overall, then yeah, of course we shouldn't do that. But we can't do that. There is no magical pill. So the problem is that you're saying we need to make better medical care so people aren't suffering, but there is no better medical care. Even with better medical care, they still request physician-assisted suicide.
And I think it's not just the medical care, but with that, it's more mental. And I think pastoral care should be given, and mental help can be given, and that can help with that instead of just killing them.
It is. That's why they do a medical check to make sure someone isn't mentally ill. The dying aren't mentally ill, and that's why they're dying, right? That has nothing to do with it. It is that they actually don't have any autonomy. They are in the active process of suffering. No amount of mental care can remove your physical suffering.
Yes, but it's found that it's not, they don't want to end it because of the suffering, but because of fear and pressure. And
yeah.
also,
I mean, like we agree it's not all we agree it's not all physical suffering. I'm talking about mental suffering too, right? So someone who is losing their autonomy is not mentally ill. Someone who's requesting physician-assisted suicide is not mentally ill, and that's why they're requesting physician-assisted suicide. They're requesting pass because they're dying, because they don't have autonomy, because they don't have their dignity, because they can't move their body anymore, because they don't have a choice of when they can go to the bathroom, because of those sorts of things. And no amount of palliative care changes those conditions. So I don't see how there's a better alternative by allowing them to continue suffering when they're going to die anyway.
because it's out of like despair and hopelessness that they want to end it, and because it's more mental, counseling, pastoral care, all that can help them cope with that, but still, and everything, care be given so that they're comfortable without killing them.
When that's done, they still request pass more often. That's what The Economist in 2010 found. Whenever they are given more of those sorts of things, they request pass more often, not less.
I think with not, I know just improving the palliative care wouldn't do it because, but if we improve the palliative care, but also integrated pastoral care, counseling, families actually supporting and knowing how to handle it, and them not feeling pressured and all that, and the fear of being a burden to everyone, it would be better than killing them.
Okay, well, I mean, I just don't see the evidence for that, but I guess we can move on to a different thing because I kind of pressed you on that. Do you want to press me on something?
I think you've already answered the questions I've had prepared.
Okay, cool. So I have a question. For the do you know what the doctrine of double effect is?
No.
Okay, so let's say by some rare circumstance, because I think you mentioned this, that the doctor uses physician-assisted suicide and the person wasn't going to die. The argument then is that, like, well, because the patient could have lived, the doctor then killed them. That's an argument you made, right?
Yeah.
So this kind of is a problem because of the doctrine of double effect. So imagine if, for example, we denied all physician-assisted suicide because someone could live, then we are guaranteeing that all those people will continue suffering. So according to ARIMA in 2025, if we ban assisted dying because doctors might be wrong, we guarantee that many terminally ill people will suffer longer. We're choosing certain suffering for real people in order to avoid possible mistakes. That might happen in rare cases, but that's a bad moral trade-off. In fact, consider that even if the patient lives, it may be for a very short time and with even more suffering. This would make doctors implicit in what is essentially torture. So I guess like my question would be, like, how is the doctor, by prolonging a person's suffering just because they might survive, not implicit in causing more harm to the patient?
Because I would say if you're doing everything you can to minimize pain, but not only that, keeping them comfortable, giving them support, and also it's important that they have mental help and support as well. And I would say intentionally killing them is not care. It's never been part of medical care, and it shouldn't be. It's not the answer to suffering.
But you're not doing everything you can if you deny their autonomy and their wishes.
Well, everything you can without intentionally ending their life.
Yeah, but you're denying their autonomy, right? So you can't say you're doing everything they can if you're denying the patient's autonomy and their wishes.
Well, yeah, but in that case, it's mostly because they are in despair and need mental help. If the mental help was given, then that wouldn't be the case. So the right help should be given rather than ending their life.
Okay, so let's assume, just for the sake of argument, because I think this is the crux of the debate, let's assume there is no alternative. There is no medicine, there is no care, there is nothing that would end the suffering necessary for physician-assisted suicide to not be an alleviation to suffering. Would you then agree that physician-assisted suicide should be legal?
Yes, if there was like absolutely no alternative to minimize the suffering, then yes.
Okay, cool. I mean, I would say that's kind of the debate then, because as far as I can see, all the evidence points in that direction, that there is not some alternative that can make someone's suffering go away, that can minimize someone's suffering to the point they would no longer want pass. And I haven't seen any evidence that suggests there is. In fact, as The Economist pointed out in 2010, the better the palliative care is, the better the mental health care is, the better the pastoral care is, the better all of that care is, people request pass more often, not less. So I'm just not convinced that's the case. But I think that's actually kind of the crux of the debate there.
Well, except the palliative care is the alternative, and if it is given, and since we know it's not from, like, mostly it's not from physical pain, it's mental stuff that can be addressed and fixed.
I think that's kind of on the up and up. Do we want to move on to like audience questions or anything? I see the audience going crazy, band, because I want to see anyone has any questions. Actually, let me ask one question really quickly. So, Sage, are you against like say like a DNR, or is it just like assisted suicide that you're against?
Just assisted suicide that I'm against.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah, so nobody has a question for Catherine.
I think withdrawal of life support is okay only if there's like barely any, if ever all family is okay with it and it is barely any chance of them coming out of it and surviving.
think nobody. I think you can if you can speak if you want to.
The difference is you're intentionally killing someone with that goal in assisted suicide. If you're just withdrawing and they have no chance of waking up, then they're not really there anyways. And you're not intentionally killing them.
Well, I think kind of what he's asking is like you agree that a person who's dying, right, who's no longer going to live, right, we can remove the DNR, or sorry, we can remove the life support and let them die. So if we can go ahead and do that, why not give them medication that would just end it already instead of allowing them to keep on for 2 or 3 more hours?
Because you're having intention of ending their life. That's not medical care.
Okay.
If nobody else wanted to ask, I was just kind of looking at, Catherine, I was looking at that list of questions that you had on your Google Doc. And sorry if any of these have already been asked or answered, but I'll just throw out a couple of them for either one of you to kind of just talk about. Um, do you believe that autonomy is absolute, or does it have limits?
Is that for me?
It can be for both of you.
Yeah, I think that I believe in the principalism that medical ethics operates by. So I think that like autonomy, beneficence, non-benevolence, and justice are all equally valid considerations. And of course, there's going to be a debate over which ones should be prioritized in which places. But I'm not convinced that like physician-assisted suicide really violates beneficence or non-maleficence or justice, and necessarily in all cases. But I do think it definitely preserves someone's autonomy. So I would say
I
like
think
I don't think even if oh sorry, good.
I think the limits of autonomy, it should end when it involves another life being ended.
Um, okay, I'm gonna work off of that. Um, and again, if this is, I know you guys have probably kind of already talked about it, but well, actually, never mind. I'm not gonna ask that. Let me look through the rest of your questions. Okay. I think this is probably one mainly for
Okay,
Felix.
so
Oh,
real quick, I think nobody
sorry.
I think nobody wanted a better answer, so let me do that real quick. So
Yep.
yes, there are limits to autonomy, and medical ethics considers 4 different principled criteria, which of
Boris.
course will all play in an interplay, right? Which is beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and autonomy. And of course, there's going to be situations where someone's autonomy ought to be limited. I just don't think that's pertinent to this debate because physician assisted suicide doesn't violate, as far as I can tell, justice, maleficence, or non-maleficence or beneficence, but it definitely preserves autonomy. So obviously, there are limits to the autonomous rights of a patient in accordance to those other values. I'm just not convinced that physician assisted suicide is one of those.
Okay. Felix, I'll just. I think this question was probably for you, and again, if you already talked about it, I apologize. But, and Sage, you might have to clarify this question just because I'm literally just going to read it straight off of your document. Are you aware that in countries with assisted dying, disabled and elderly people report feeling pressure to choose death?
Yeah, Yeah, I think that can be a case for a lot of things, so I don't think it's unique. But yeah, I'm sure there are cases where families have pushed people to take options they don't need. But the problem is that, excuse me, as I said, I had COVID, so I'm currently dying as well. I think that when somebody's already dying, the physician-assisted suicide acts as a way to alleviate their pain. So I don't see that as like an immoral thing, right? But beyond that, yeah, I'm sure there are cases where people are convinced by their families to take that option, and obviously that is wrong. That's why there are so many safeguards in place. I don't know about the safeguards in other countries, but in the United States, it's pretty stable to ensure that somebody is not just picking this because they're being coerced into it. Ruby asked me a question. Why do you support suicide? That's a terrible thing to support. I don't support suicide. I support physician assisted suicide. My opponent also supports suicide in the sense of voluntary passive suicide. Only difference is that I support active, which means that I think the doctor should do something to aid the patient in alleviating their suffering, which would be death. So we both support suicide in that sense. One of us just supports it when the doctor does more. I'll take the silence as I answer the question.
Yeah. I have a bit of a question for you, Felix.
Yeah.
So, is it possible that if someone is denied physician assisted suicide when they're truly like intent on killing themselves, could it be possible that that person might resort to more drastic means for accomplishing that, like may like trying to shoot themselves or
Absolutely, actually,
take some
yeah.
kind of drug
Um,
themselves to death or whatever methods people often use for suicide, running themselves over?
Oh yeah,
Or,
absolutely. In my documents, I have a file called extended harms. If you click on it, that's one of the arguments, is that whenever you deny physician-assisted suicide to someone who is applicable for it, who this applies to, they take on more rash actions to end their life, which causes more suffering for them. So yeah, absolutely, that is a problem.
Or if that was the end of that question, nobody had another one for Catherine. Why do you support withdrawal of life support? What makes it more optimal than the alternative of leaving them on?
Because if you're leaving them on and there's no chance of them being able to get off, then there's not really a point. But that's different than intentionally ending the life of someone.
So, Catherine, would you agree? Hang on. Would you agree that if someone wants to kill themselves, they'll probably find a way, like if it's an extreme case?
Yes, unless preventative measures are taken to where they can't, which should happen if anyone's thinking about that.
Well, what kind of preventative measures would you be, I guess, quote unquote, supportive of, or like what sort of preventative measures would you be referring to?
And like taking anything that they could harm themselves with, taking access from that, and then giving them the correct mental help and therapy for that.
So, who would be responsible for doing all of that? Would that be a family thing? Would that be a state thing? Would it be a private healthcare thing? Like, who would be in charge of, governing a person's life to that degree?
Family and whoever their healthcare provider is could work together to make that happen.
Boris? Boris?
Cool. I guess if there's no more questions, we can move on to like closings and then make way for the next debate. Is that good with Sage?
Yeah, that's good. You want me to
Okay,
do
cool.
mine first?
Yeah, the next one. Yeah. Real quick though, yes. Doc wanted to point out the next one is at 10 Eastern Standard Time, so it's in about an hour and a half, I do believe.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So Sage can go first, and then I'll wrap mine up.
All right. All people have worth and value. That worth doesn't disappear when someone becomes sick, dependent, or vulnerable. Death isn't the answer to suffering, and physician assisted suicide crosses a line that medicine was never meant to cross. The intentional ending of a human life. It violates the core ethics that protect patients. It's sought for reasons rooted in despair and pressure, not pain, and it creates a culture where the most vulnerable begin to see themselves as burdens. We have compassionate alternatives, palliative care, hospice, pain management, and human presence. These options relieve suffering without eliminating the person who suffers. And legalizing assisted suicide doesn't solve suffering. Instead, it normalizes the idea that some lives are no longer worth living. And physician assisted suicide shouldn't be legal because it violates medical ethics in place, the reasoning patients seek it. Alternatives are available that doesn't include death and it devalues people. We should stand on the side of life, dignity, and protection for every person. I urge you to reject physician-assisted suicide and defend a society that responds to suffering with care and
What are you
not
doing down
killing.
there?
Cool. So first off, I want to thank my opponent for joining me in this debate. Um, physician-assisted suicide is a really important topic. It's actually the first topic I ever wrote any paper on. So I want to thank her for this debate, and I want to thank the audience for listening in, of course. But I do think there are a few reasons why we should believe that physician-assisted suicide is the most moral option and ought to be legal. And I believe that the crux of this argument for why it shouldn't relied upon the idea that there's some kind of
What are you doing down
alternative
there?
care which can be implemented, which would alleviate someone's choice for physician-assisted suicide. And I think as The Economist demonstrated in 2010, I think as every piece of evidence has demonstrated thus far, there really isn't one. Whenever people are given better palliative care, better mental health care, better care overall, they still end up requesting physician-assisted suicide. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember, because it's not about the quality of care that someone ends up requesting physician-assisted suicide. It's not that a person is suffering physically and so they want this sort of ending to their life. It's that they are dying and they don't want to continue suffering dying. They don't want to continue losing their autonomy. They don't want to be incontinent anymore. They don't want to be unable to move anymore. And of course, yeah, they don't want physical pain, but there's more to it than that. And so I don't think there is any sort of alternative that would respect that. And even if there is, what? We continue their suffering for an hour more, for 2 hours more, for a day more, and just let them die naturally rather than take a step to make sure they no longer suffer. I don't see that as a good difference, but as a good benefit. But to reiterate my point, from the doctrine of double effect, allowing people to continue suffering just because there might be some mistake or just because there might be some way out of it is not particularly moral from a consequentialist or utilitarian view. Just allowing people to suffer just out of principle also isn't particularly moral. So I would find that there is no real argument for why something like assisted suicide should not be legal. Thank you all for listening.
All right.
Cool.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Felix and Catherine. We'll be back in about an hour and a half. It'll be myself and Dak, and I posted the topic in chat, but it's going to be on the average. I guess the topic is the average American was better off between the 1940s to the 1980s approximately than they are today. And I'll be taking the affirmative on that. So if y'all want to listen to that, it'll be in an hour and a half. So hopefully everybody shows up for that.
Yeah, I will. Thank you very much, everyone.